We're talking today about A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. He was born in 1897 and lived till 1962. He was born on September 21st in New Albany, Mississippi, moved to Oxford, Mississippi at age 5. He was born to a once wealthy family that owned plantations. He was a high school dropout, wrote poetry as a teenager, worked at Winchester Repeating Arms Company and a bookstore and the newspaper in New Orleans. He tried to enlist as a pilot in World War II, but was turned down because he was too short. He later then joined the British Royal Air Force. He studied at the University of Mississippi. He was remembered both as a gentlemanly, southern, eccentric, but he was also very arrogant and snobbish and was an alcoholic. In 1929, he married his wife Estelle Oldman. They had 2 daughters. The first daughter died after only a few days, and the second daughter, Jill, was born in 1933. He was known to have affairs. That was pretty common knowledge. He made very little money on his books until he won the Nobel Prize, and that was in 1950. He died of a heart attack July 6th of 1962. His works included, he used to use his home in Mississippi for many of his works. He wrote fiction stories and novels, also some screenplays, and that's how he kind of made his money with some of the screenplays that would provide for his family. He invented an imaginary county and its inhabitants, and they were pretty typical of the historical South. His theme was kind of the decay of the South and how the Civil War affected the southern states. And one of the quotes was, "The poet, the writer's duty is to write about these things. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of a man. It could be one of the props, the pillars, and help him endure and prevail."
Okay, the synopsis part of this. First of all, we've got Miss Emily's father, who is one of the characters. In this, there's no trace of grief on her face when he dies, and she was in denial of her father's death. And a snail was broken out around that time. She refused to bury him, wanted to keep him in the house. But once she did break down, then the townspeople quickly moved in and took his body and buried it quickly. There was a manservant that lived with Miss Emily. Of course, he was a Negro person. And townspeople would meet Miss Emily at the front door. She would not let them in the house. And he plays a key role in the book, or in the story, because he is the only link between Miss Emily's life and the community in which she's living in. Homer Barron is another main character. A few years after her father died, he comes in as a foreman on a job with the city. He is a northern Yankee. He drinks a lot, cusses at the niggers. And just treats people badly in many respects. Our relationship between Miss Emily and Homer is noticed in the community when they go for buggy rides and other activities. The townspeople are very judgmental about this relationship because Miss Emily was always held in high regards, and for her to be hanging out with a foreman or someone of lower class, they had a problem with. And Homer always said that he was not the marrying type. Miss Emily goes to the drugstore and asks the pharmacist for some arsenic or a type of poison. She starts buying some men's clothes, and she goes to the jeweler. And so the townspeople believe that Miss Emily and Homer were getting married. And after she had purchased these items, she became reclusive. Miss Emily dies at age 74. The first ladies that came in, the manservant let them into the house, and then heart of the plot to this story, being the connection between Miss Emily and the community. The surprise ending to this story was that when they entered the house after Miss Emily died, there was a locked door, and they ended up having to kick it in order to gain access. The room was furnished as a bridal room, in which we get part of the title as it was colored in a faded rose color. There was a man himself lay in the bed, and the body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace. So therefore, Miss Emily had used the arsenic on him, and then placed him in the bed, holding him, not burying him like he wanted to do with her father. Then we noticed that the second pillow was the indentation of a head, and we saw a long strand of gray hair on the pillow. And Miss Emily had murdered Homer so that he would be with her always, just like she wanted her father to be with her always. She did not want to bury her father, nor did she want to bury Homer, and they determined that indeed she was insane.
A Rose for Emily took place in 1929. It was written during the harshest time in the nation, the Great Depression. The Reconstruction era after the war, when the North took control of the South. The changes the South adopted after the Civil War. William describes the Garrison House, a prominent structure. It was a big squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with capels and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily light stone style of the 70s, set on what had once been our most select street. This is a representation of what the house in the South were prior to the end of the Civil War, and gradually decay of the house, and Emily represent the changes that came after the Civil War had ended. The end of the Civil War brought about changes for the South that not all Southern population was content with. The negligence of Emily to pay taxes may refer to the South's unwillingness to pay for the financial crisis that the Yankees had put the nation in. In A Rose for Emily, we are presented with the many changes that society is going through in a parallel to reality through a literal work. A Rose for Emily is an important short story that reflects what they went through in the South and Reconstruction era from the late 1800s to the 1900s. This story is relevant to our lives today because it really shows what the Negroes went through back in the 1800s, when they thought that a Negro woman should be wearing an apron or should be a slave. You do not see that in our lives today, which makes you open up your eyes when you're reading this story.
The point of view in this story is a first-person point of view. We is a term that's used most often. It's the point of view of the townspeople, but it kind of shifts as it goes throughout the story. There's really no clues to whether it's a man or a woman, and the point of view spans different generations. This point of view looks at Emily from several different perspectives. There's a level of respect, as he calls the person a fallen monument. There's pity. At last we could pity Miss Emily when her father passes away and leaves her basically penniless in this big old mansion. Admiration. No matter what the adversity was, she still carried her head high, and so when people were talking about her with Homer, she still very much was a lady. The question that we kind of ask is, does the narrator look at Miss Emily through rose-colored glasses? She seems to, or the writer seems to have some respect and feel that she has some dignity to her. The other question is, could Toby be the narrator? Toby was the manservant that was with her the whole time, and when they go in and discover that, when she dies, he goes out the back door, so it kind of leads you to believe that maybe he knew all along what was really going on there. The point of view in the story is interesting because it's somewhat mysterious, kind of like the story is. Yeah.
The symbolism and imaginary, the house lifting its stubborn and coardish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps, an eyesore among eyesores, symbol of decay. Represents a generation of prosperity, respect, and isolation, now left in the past. New generation sees it as old and creepy. Miss Emily's appearance, she looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water, and of that paled hue, symbol of death. Narrator shows time passing by hair growing grayer and grayer. Much like the house deteriorates throughout the story, Miss Emily's experience is also seen as an old and creepy. The imaginary makes the story come to life and gives us an eerie feeling, symbols of dying generations. Foreshadowing. No trace of grief on her face at the death of her father. Denial of death. Wanting to see. Wanted to keep the body. The smell from the house, a short time after her sweetheart, the one we believed would marry her, had deserted her. The townspeople put lime around it. Arsenic for rats. Wouldn't tell why she wanted it. The locked room, a thin, acrid pale, as of the tomb, seemed to lie everywhere upon this room. Foreshadowing gives us clues as we read to keep us in suspense.
Some of the themes that we found in the story was that there was a gap between generations and the tradition versus change. Miss Emily was stuck in a time of a Colonel Sartoris in 1894, in which he was head of the town, and he had made an agreement with Miss Emily's father that he would not have to pay taxes. So Miss Emily, after her father died, refused to continue to pay the taxes because of that agreement. She refused to have a mailbox when there was free postal delivery offered. And thus, she passed from generation to generation, dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. Emily's father also robs her of life's necessities, which was love. He was a very harsh man with her, and that developed a strong inner sense of pride and craving for love in her, which ends up driving her to murder Homer. Because she also lived in a sense of seclusion or isolation after the death of Homer, after she killed Homer, that they lived, because of her isolation, that she suffered from mental illness. Artwork gave the story a thumbs up rating of 8. We liked the story because it was suspenseful. The imagery was very vivid and perplexing. It made you wonder what was coming up next, that it had a way of drawing you into the story. It describes the difficult times that the country faced after the Civil War, which also reflected on our society as each generation makes changes in our culture also. The ending caught us all by surprise, and it makes us think about the effects that society can make on one person's mental health. And here we have our sources listed. If you'd like more information, you can go out to any of these websites.